Dear God in heaven, we are so thankful again for this Sabbath day, especially that we can meet together in freedom and peace, rest and trust in you. We thank you for your spirit that is guiding and leading your movement, moment by moment, giving us just what is needed. So we ask that you be with us, give us wisdom in this time of our second study regarding the compromise, that we will understand it and take this as a whole picture and apply it to the lines that we are looking at now in our own time, our own day. So I pray that you will guide our minds. And again, we want to praise you and thank you for your hand being over Francisco and his operation. Also, Christine supporting him as well as strengthening her and both of them. And we thank you for everything going well, and we will continue to keep them in prayer and know that your hand is upon them. So we thank you for all of our blessings, especially on the Sabbath day. And we thank you that, again, we can be prepared by applying the truths that you're giving us now from the past, but yet they're very relevant to the time we're living in. So we're just rejoicing and thanking you for all the blessings, for Elder Tess, Elder Parmender, for Elaine and her service, and others, teachers around the world. Yes, that you're with everyone who is reaching out and who is been called by you to a work at this time that we're living in, as we all have been. And we thank you for this. Thank you for hearing our prayers. And we praise you and thank you for your great love for us and for humanity. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, Phil, I hope that your internet, Susan too, your internet's doing a little bit better. Maybe it is a sporadic thing at times.
Yeah, if you can hear me, I could read.
Yeah, I can. Now, if you're still talking, I can't.
Yeah, so I can read the next study. My internet is unstable.
Still? Okay. Okay. So this one is the one that followed in the order that she did them in. Gotta move out of the way. Biden compromise and the midnight cry. So we went through Henry Clay. I think I did this one, so I think this was a quote from a website. Preparing to assume the presidency in a divided country, Joe Biden confronts the ultimate test of his principal theory of governance, that compromise is good and modest progress is still progress. What did we see about in the previous study about what they wanted to do with slavery? Anybody remember that as pertain, kind of going along with what this quote says?
You mean the Fugitive Slave Act?
Yeah, well, there was a particular quote that was talking about how they, with all the compromising going on, that they didn't want to hit it so hard. They just wanted over time for it to go away.
Oh, they just ignored it.
Yeah. And then over
Right, they just ignored it.
yeah. So his principal theory of governance, that that compromise is good and modest progress is still progress. So just take little steps at a time. And how do we know? What do we know about what gets things done? What finally gets, does compromise and little progress ever accomplish anything? Anything big?
So Band-Aid stopgap measure.
Yeah. So when it comes to this extreme oppression, the little Band-Aids and compromises to take a little step here and there will never fix it. Requires attention, radical attention. So where we finished last was in 1850 with the 1850 Compromise. The 1850 Compromise is linked directly to 1844. So you've got the Compromise directly linked to 1844. And 1844 was directly linked to 1840, this election here. In 1840, the Whig Party compromises, and we saw that the Whig Party was formed in 1833. And here the Whig Party compromises, and then the president dies. And that Whig Party, they compromise, they get a vice president from the South, who's, they wanted to try to win votes from the South. And so the vice president then becomes president. So now they have a pro-slavery president. He's a slavery sympathizer, well, slavery sympathizing, not pro-slavery, expansionist. He brings that idea of annexing Texas to the forefront. The Democrat Party run with that in 1844. They win and annex Texas, Oregon, and California. In 1850, what they're struggling with, so let me go back. I'm going to remove this, but I need to remember how to get it back. Hang on one second. Because I want to read this top part. You guys can probably still see it anyways. I couldn't. So you have 1840, William Henry Harrison, and he chooses a vice president, John Taylor, who's a slave sympathizer, slavery sympathizing expansionist. Harrison dies, and John Taylor takes over. Then you have a Democrat Party run in 1844 and win, and they annex Texas, Oregon, and California. In 1850, what they're struggling with is what to do with slavery in these new territories. So the new territories come in, and now what to do with slavery. And that disagreement in 1850 becomes dangerous. Kind of interesting when you think about because I think we were talking about this last night, that I was slow and didn't pay attention in school, all that kind of stuff. But the Constitution, when you make it a constitutional right, then the states have to abide by the Constitution. But if you don't make it a constitutional right, or you remove it, overturn it, so it's no longer a constitutional right, then each individual state gets to decide for themselves. So we know that their issue with slavery, our issue is gender. And so what happens when you have, what happens here when they have it up to the individual states and they're fighting over wanting to have the right balance of states, pro-slavery states. So, and that disagreement in 1850 becomes dangerous. The Whig Party won the last election with Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. The Missouri Compromise was all about new territory and what to do with slavery in these territories. The issue in 1850 was quite similar. A quote from Digital History, a paraphrase: Henry Clay is old and sick, especially elderly for their time period when you didn't live as long. He's rushing to visit a friend. This friend is Daniel Webster, the brother of the man who wrote Webster's dictionary. They were close allies. Clay is terrified of what is about to happen to the Union, so he visits Webster and introduces him to a compromise that he has developed. Then he brings that proposal that they've both agreed upon to the Senate. He asks them to put away what divides them in the place of nationalism, national patriotism. He asks them to put away what divides them in the place of national patriotism. So put away slavery and those things that divide you, and in the name of national patriotism, accept a compromise. And this is not well received. John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster. John C. Calhoun threatens Southern secession, and that's from what we read about him earlier. He's always threatening. And who was it? It was Zachary Taylor, I think it was, that came in and said, I'm not going to take your threats and we're going to stand up to it, if I remember right. John C. Calhoun threatens Southern secession. Clay has the full support of Daniel Webster, but there are some in the North who are anti-slavery and reject a compromise on slavery. So you've got the ones that want to walk the middle, and then you have your anti-slavery who are going to reject a compromise on slavery. Slavery has to be dealt with. We should be familiar by now with John C. Calhoun, but we want to remember another name. We want to consider William H. Seward of New York. He called Webster and with him Clay and their compromise, but specifically Daniel Webster, for defending that compromise. He called them a traitor to the cause of freedom. The Southerners feel comfort that they see the North will compromise, but there are some in the North who see that compromise and hate it. The president, Zachary Taylor, says we need to admit all of this new territory and then consider slavery afterwards. This would have given a massive benefit to the North. It would have given a 10 vote majority in the Senate. They could have overruled any Southern claims. William H. Seward gives a speech in the Senate. He denounces the compromise. He says there's a higher law than the Constitution, a law that demanded an end to slavery. William H. Seward was one of the foremost critics of the Compromise of 1850, and he was severely criticized for that speech. During his speech, Daniel Webster decided that he needed to take care of other duties. Clay was restless, and within 20 minutes, the previously packed galleries had almost entirely emptied. He was attacked as being a reckless enemy of the Constitution, subverting that great document to some type of nebulous higher law. But those Northern who does he sound like there? Criticizing the great document for some nebulous higher law. Who does that sound like?
I want to say Trump. Maybe not.
Well, he's anti-slavery, if I'm following correctly. Did I follow that correctly?
Yeah.
He doesn't accept the compromise. He wants to do away with slavery. So he's criticizing the Constitution. Why? Why is he criticizing the Constitution? I can't see the chat or even the notification. So if you're able, or if somebody puts in the chat, somebody that can talk, read it for me. So Daniel Webster is anti-slavery. Make sure I got this right. Sorry, William Seward, William Seward, H. Seward from New York. He called Webster and Clay, and with him Clay, and their compromise, but specifically Daniel Webster, for defending that compromise, a traitor. So Seward is calling Clay and Webster traitors for defending the compromise. Did I read that right? He called Webster and with him Clay and their compromise, but specifically Webster, for defending that compromise a traitor to the cause of freedom. The Southerners feel comfort that they see the North will compromise because Clay and Webster, they're cooking up this compromise, and Seward is against it. And the South is seeing the North being going to be compromising with them on slavery. So, but there is some in the North who see that compromise and hate it. The president, Zachary Taylor, says we need to admit all of this new territory and then consider afterwards, slavery afterwards. This would have given a massive benefit to the North. It would have given a 10-vote majority in the Senate. They could have overruled any Southern claims. William H. Seward gives a speech in the Senate. He denounces the compromise. He says there's a higher law in the Constitution, a law that demanded an end to slavery. So why is he criticizing the Constitution? Why is he saying that there's something higher than that that demands the end of slavery? Anybody remember Obama's speech? I think it was 2020.
Is that talking about the star?
Yeah, the North Star.
The North Star, it's
And
progressive.
Yeah, and the Constitution
Constitution.
was, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Said it's progressive. What's Troy saying? Is he saying something?
It was an imperfect document.
Imperfect, yeah.
It had slavery written into it. So Seward is saying there's a higher law than the Constitution that demands an end to slavery. So he knows slavery shouldn't be there. Okay, so he's one of the foremost critics of the compromise in 1850, and he was severely criticized for that speech. So then they left him there, everybody left. Within 20 minutes, the previously packed galleries had almost entirely emptied. He was attacked as being a reckless enemy of the Constitution because he wasn't taking it literally. Literally, even though this word slavery wasn't there, this slavery was implied. And he's attacking that, and he's being called a reckless enemy of the Constitution because you're speaking against slavery, because our Constitution calls for slavery, subverting that great document to some type of nebulous higher law. But those Northern anti-slavery Whigs did defend him, but because the president won't endorse it, the compromise appeared to be dead. Disappointed and exhausted, Henry Clay left Washington. Then with an unexpected suddenness, the outlook abruptly changed. July 1850, President Taylor died. Fillmore was an ardent supporter of compromise, and he passed it. And if I remember right, somebody help me, Zachary Taylor, I think was the one, I think I mentioned it a minute ago, but I wasn't sure about it, but I'm pretty sure Zachary Taylor was the one that when the South would just threaten to secede, he basically called them on it. Is that correct? I have to go back through the previous notes. I think it was Zachary Taylor. Anyway, so now Fillmore, though, who supports the compromise, he passed it. So through the death of presidents, the one in 1840 was a result of the compromise, and they choose a slave sympathizer from the South, John Tyler. They wind up losing their Whig president because he dies and replaced with a Southern vice president. So here you have, again, Zachary Taylor, who's, if I remember correctly with him, against slavery, or against the compromise, and Fillmore, he dies and Fillmore takes his place and he supports the compromise. So he passed it. So New Mexico and Utah could decide slavery for themselves. California was allowed to be a free state. The slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia. In a separate issue, Texas was paid off. What caused abolitionists the most heartache was that fugitive slave clause to please the South. The fugitive slave clause, meaning that if you're a free state and a slave escapes to a free state, the slave is not free, that you have a responsibility and a duty to return the slave to their slave owner. So it doesn't do away with slavery. And it puts a burden on those that are anti-slavery. Many in the North believed that this issue had been resolved peacefully. One Northerner wrote, "There is rejoicing over the land." But one Southern editor wrote, "It is the calm of preparation and not peace." 2 years later, Henry Clay dies, that Kentucky politician whom Lincoln called his beautiful idea of a statesman. Abraham Lincoln gave his eulogy. He says, "There are many people who don't like what Henry Clay did, but there is little or no disagreement amongst intelligent and patriotic Americans in support of the Missouri question, 1818 to 1821, nullification that was the 1833 tariff compromise, and now the recent compromise measures." So you have Abraham Lincoln, if that's the right word, complimenting Henry Clay on his ability to hold the Union together and compromise. The one who would eventually free the slaves, as we have always understood. But he did what he did to save the Union. Not because he believed in it. In 1852, what are the recent compromise measures? So Abraham Lincoln lists these three and says every patriotic, intelligent American would support them. He then speaks favorably about Clay's position on slavery because Lincoln and Clay's positions were quite identical. And he says, first of all, he knows that Clay was a slave owner part of his life. He wanted the end of slavery, but like every wise man, he saw that to eradicate it would produce a greater evil to the cause of human liberty itself. Their fear was if they freed those slaves would rise up and take away liberty from the white people. What does that remind you of? Old Testament.
Israel and Egypt.
That's what I think about, yeah. Yeah, where they were afraid of the Hebrews rising up and being too many. So Clay opposed both extremes of opinion. We've already seen that one of those extremes was abolition. He opposed both extremes, and one of those was abolition. An extreme position for that time, even in the North. Ellen White says in volume 1 of the testimonies, 264-2, that fugitive slave law was calculated to crush out of man every noble, generous feeling of sympathy. It was in direct opposition to the teaching of Christ, a higher law, like William H. Seward said, God's scourge is now upon the North because they have so long submitted to the advances of slave power. They have sanctioned the extension of slavery. It extended every time they compromised and allowed for another slave state. They did that in the name of upholding the Constitution and the liberty and freedom of the states. So if we think about that in gender terms, in our 30 years or so, compromise continues to allow for inequality. Would that be right to say? I don't want to say it wrong. After 1850, the South has more and more victories in the Supreme Court and in Congress. The Missouri Compromise, which limits slavery, is abolished. There is a Kansas-Nebraska Act, and there is also the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and there is also the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, all of which favor the South. We won't go into them for time. In the North, the states are largely refusing to abide by the 1850 slave clause, violating the Constitution and the law. So we come to the 1860 election, and society is polarized. Tension is high. The Democrat Party is divided, which splits their vote. So now the Whig Party collapsed in the 1850s because of people like Seward, who were so opposed to these compromises. The party collapses, and now you have the rise of the Republican Party. Democrat Party is divided, which splits their votes. The Republican Party replaces the Whig Party, which is now collapsed. Now in 1860, they have to pick a presidential candidate. We're reading from a book by the Charles River editors called The Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. Quoting, as they came together to decide their candidate, William H. Seward was the frontrunner. This same Seward who fought against the 1850 compromise. Now, what are they afraid of? We need to win this election. If we have a radical, they will lose votes in the Midwest. So while Seward is the front runner at the beginning, so many people are afraid of his radical view of abolition. He falls down the list of favorites until they choose Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a compromise. You only have to go back and see how the two men stood in 1850. A little history of William H. Seward. He risked his entire political career on the conviction that all men should be free. He made sure that fugitive slaves were guaranteed to trial by jury. In 1846, he defended a free Black man who'd murdered 4 members of a white family because he believed this Black man was insane and wouldn't get a fair trial by a white judge. During that trial, he gives some quite profound statements, profound for them. He's talking to the jury and asks them, quote, whether or not they've lifted their souls above the bondage of prejudice. The color of the prisoner's skin and the form of his features are not impressed upon the spiritual, immortal mind which works beneath them. He's your brother and mine in form and color, accepted by his father and your father and my father, and bears equality with us, the proudest inheritance that we have, the image of our Maker. Hold him to be a man. His court case was unsuccessful. His house was a stop along the Underground Railroad. In 1855, he wrote to a friend, quoting, the Underground Railroad works wonderfully. 2 passengers came here last night, end quote. It was he and his son that carried the Emancipation Proclamation to the White House to be signed. He was the one that should have been their president, but they want the votes of the people, so Abraham Lincoln was the compromise. The same year, 1858, that Seward gave a speech against slavery, Abraham Lincoln was doing his famous debates against Douglas to win a seat on the Senate. We read these quotes in Portugal. quoting, he says someone asked him whether or not he believed in perfect equality between the Black people and the white people. Lincoln says, I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing in any way the social and political equality of the races. I am not and never have been in favor of giving them the ability to vote or sit on a jury, nor to hold political office, nor to intermarry. Because of their physical differences, I believe that we will ever forbid them to live together on terms of social and political equality. And in so much that we do live together, there must be superior and inferior. As much as any man, I am in favor of the white race being superior. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I have no lawful right to do so and no inclination to do so. He says quite a lot, and yet still the South considered him too radical because, like in 1844, he spoke two different things to two different groups of people. He was a compromiser himself and a compromised candidate. We saw how he commended Henry Clay for his compromises to be able to hold the Union together. When he is elected, the South secedes from the Union. That's the 1860 election. The Republicans won it, but they compromised. We may be all familiar with Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction. 1865, Abraham Lincoln was reelected. They've won the Civil War. They were going to win it from 1863, it was clear. But they don't want the South to feel too bad, so they're going to pick a Southern vice president who supports slavery. They haven't learned from 1840 when their president died, or 1848 when their president died. And when Lincoln dies in 1865, who's president and who gets to reconstruct the United States? Even when they're winning the war, they still feel the need to compromise, because how much do they really believe in equality? I don't know if this is right, but it seems to me like they kind of, I don't know if it's a sympathy, but do they have a sympathy with the Southern? I mean, did they just pull in a Southern vice president just to, or a slave supporting vice president just to, can't think of the right words. Is there like a sympathy for him, and is it part of the Union is we can all get along and he doesn't recognize the differences, or what? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. If you're able to understand what my thoughts I'm trying to express.
It seems that the North was appeasing the South
I got appeasing the South
unnecessarily.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the previous slide or somewhere in there, it said that they compromise even when they don't have to compromise, unless that was this slide. But they compromise even when they don't have to compromise. Just wondering what the motive was in that. Because you see here clearly that got him into trouble each time. Yeah, right here. Even when they're winning the war, they still feel the need to compromise. Because how much do they really believe in equality? Yeah, think about that statement. If you think of the Eden to Eden, and you think of all the trees of the garden that you can eat from, and then you think of the one tree that you're not supposed to eat from, how much do you really believe? You prove it by your vote, right? You prove it by your vote. So by what they've done with each of these times, they show that they really, really don't believe in equality.
It kind of reminds me of what's going on with the mayoral race right now in Los Angeles. One of the candidates swung from Republican to Democrat only because California is mostly Democrat and he wanted to win. But his heart is with the Republicans, but he swung Democrat just so he could get the votes. That could be. part
Wow,
of the
yeah,
reason.
I've heard something about that. I didn't know the details of it. Thank you. I knew there was something going on in the mayoral race in LA. So if you're a Democrat and you know that a Republican just switched parties, would you be able to trust him?
Absolutely not. I believe that was Rick Caruso. I've seen a lot of the advertisements where that he paid billions of dollars in order to get elected. And it looks like he just might win it. That was against Karen Bass, but his heart is Republican. but
Is
he
that what they're
switched to
saying about him?
That's what they're saying about him, just to get the votes, because California is mostly a Democratic state. So he could win, he switched to Democrat, but you know, his heart is with the Republicans.
I was just wondering because we've seen, you know, and I don't know how, I don't know. Well, I'm thinking about like, look for instance at Liz Cheney, just as an example. And Kinzinger, is that his name? They're still Republicans. They just are not that far right Republican that Trump came in and handled. So they're still, so is it somebody like that? Or is it somebody that's really, well, they're all just, they can all be deceptive. I don't know how to ask the question. Or, because you see Liz Cheney, a Republican, standing up against all of this. But I was thinking about that the other day. Would you see Liz Cheney go be a Democrat? Probably not. Because they don't believe in the same, and value the same things. We'll have to keep our eye on what happens in LA then. So this would be for us as well internally. How much do we
Yes.
really believe in equality? Go ahead. Were you going to say something? Okay, we'll keep going then. So the Civil War is fought in 1861. Trump supporters would say that Civil War was about maybe state rights. It was all about slavery for the South. Why was Lincoln, okay, so Trump supporters say the Civil War was maybe states' rights. It was all about slavery for the South. Why was Lincoln fighting that war? A gentleman wrote to him in mid-1862, the influential editor of the New York Tribune. It was an open letter that he published to Lincoln, and he told Lincoln, "You're compromising." Congress had already passed provisions to allow emancipation. So you have the North and the South, but there are border states that are part of the Union in the North that have sided with the North, but are themselves slave states. You have, let's see, you have the North and the South, but there are border states, okay, that are part of the Union in the North that have sided with the North, but are themselves slave states. So in 1862, Lincoln is still compromising to make sure that these slave border states stay with the North. This is what he's being accused of. Okay, so you've got the border states, you've got the North and the South, and you have the border states, and they're slave states. Let's see. So in 1862, Lincoln is still compromising to make sure that the slave border states stay with the North. And this is what he's being accused of. Lincoln responds to this open letter and says, "I've never intended to leave anyone in doubt about the course I am pursuing. I'm fighting this war to save the Union, and I will do that the shortest way possible under the Constitution." Well, what does that mean? Shortest way possible, what does it mean under the Constitution? Constitution supports slavery. My first object is to save the Union and not either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I will do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the Black race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. What I don't do because I do not believe it will help to save the Union. So it is entirely accurate to say that the Civil War was fought over slavery. Is it entirely accurate that the Civil War was fought over slavery? Not according to Lincoln. He was saving the Union, and whatever it took, if slavery, freeing the slaves, save the Union, or if not freeing the slaves, save the Union, he would do it, because he was about saving the Union, not stopping slavery. What was God calling them to do in this history?
Save the slaves.
Yeah. We're going to paraphrase a few Ellen White quotes. If you look in Testimonies, Volume 1, 363, and in the 250s, she speaks a lot about slavery. She's in this early history in the early 1860s. She says many were blinded and grossly deceived in the last election. They placed in authority men who would wink at evil, men who would witness a flood of woe and misery unmoved, whose principles are corrupt, who are Southern sympathizers, and would preserve slavery as it is. She never names people, but when you think that these are being written at the same time period as Abraham Lincoln's comments, however much she's impeded by sexism, she knows all about Seward, all that Lincoln said in his 1858 debates, and we should read these quotes understanding that context. Many were blinded and grossly deceived when they placed Lincoln. Page 254, paragraph 1. Thousands have been induced to enlist with the understanding that this war was to exterminate. Oh, somebody else read for me. Okay, so nobody picked up. I don't know, somebody must have walked out front. Sorry about that. So she never names people. Let's see where we were at. Many were blinded and grossly deceived when they placed Lincoln. Okay, thousands have been induced to enlist with the understanding that this war was to exterminate slavery, but now they're stuck in the war. They're seeing they were deceived. That object of the North was not to abolish slavery. Lincoln had said that, and she's describing that as a deception upon thousands who joined the Northern Army. Quoting again, they left their homes and sacrificed their lives to exterminate slavery. And at that point in time, they see no good results from the war except to preserve the Union, and they're dissatisfied. That's interesting when you take that still into the context of where we're headed with sexism, but that's future, I think. So does she care about the preservation of the Union? That war should have been fought to exterminate slavery, and it was not. It was fought to hold together the country. She says it looks to her like an impossibility for slavery to be done away. All that abuse and cruelty exercised towards the slave is chargeable to all who have upheld the slave system, whether they are Southern or Northern. It's another interesting one too, because you could put that all that abuse and cruelty exercised towards women and LGBTQ is chargeable to all who have upheld the slave system, whether you're on the left or the right. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Her position is opposed to that. I mean, we're living in the time when God is going to overturn gender inequality. And we're reading what was supposed to happen in this history, and slavery was to be done away with. There was no in-between ground, no middle ground. You're all going to be accountable. Her position is opposed to that of Lincoln vehemently. She says God alone can wrench the slave from the hand of his oppressor. We're not trying to make direct applications of people in this study, but if we can get a sense of the compromise that had occurred from 1798 through to the Civil War. So when Ellen White says God is judging the North, we understand why. It's because of the men like Clay and Webster and Lincoln. When there were protests in America right now and they're tearing down statues, these aren't the statues heavily targeted, because these are the good men. These were on the side that you would cheer for and vote for. We haven't discussed the Democrat Party much at all. The John C. Calhouns, the sin of the South, that should be clear to everyone. What we want to get is a feel for the compromise of the North. It's the history of the Civil War. It's their time of trouble, and she says only God can free the slaves. How is he going to do that? In the middle of the first year of the war, she says that she sees a battle scene. It's shown to her. She sees the Southern and Northern armies charge. The Northern army starts to win. There's desperate fighting. There is desperate fighting. But just as that Northern side seems to be winning, she sees angels come down and start to help the South. They extend the length of that battle by giving help to the South. God was deliberately extending the Civil War. He wasn't going to let the South win, but he wasn't going to let the North win too quickly. Why would that be? This was mid-1861. A whole year later, in August 1862, Lincoln is saying that if he could win that war and still permit slavery, he would do it. So if God wants the end of slavery, what does he have to do? He has to make that war hurt. Really sad when you hear it that way. Late 1862, Lincoln had drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. From 61 to mid-63, neither side was winning. The North couldn't get the upper hand over the South. Lincoln is saying, if I can bring the Union together and still permit slavery, I will do it. So God essentially says, I'm not going to let you bring the Union together until you get rid of slavery. He's a Pharaoh at war with God, and he's going to hurt until he does what he's told. January 1863, he passes the Emancipation Proclamation. Mid-1863, the Battle of Gettysburg, the North begins to win. Yet even then, the Emancipation Proclamation was a compromise. He freed all the slaves in the South, but none of the slaves in the border states. So about 500,000 slaves were still kept in bondage till the end of the Civil War. Why are we looking at this history? We're looking at it because it has direct prophetic application to today. We're tracing the history of the good men. We began to do that in Portugal in April. We're not looking at the Bannons, the Donald Trumps, the Mitch McConnells, the Jeff Sessions. We're looking at the nice centrist Democrats. There's 3 specific compromises that the Whig Party made. We haven't listed 1865 because it's outside of our reform line. 1864, but where they particularly compromised was at every election, and the compromise sounds reasonable. If you want to end slavery, shouldn't you do it in a way that upholds the Constitution and the rule of law as it's written? Shouldn't you do that in a way that holds the United States together? Shouldn't you do that with a candidate who you know will get enough votes? The issue of slavery back then was complex. It had major implications for the financial system, for the medical system, for schools. It required complex answers, and it wasn't simple. So you wanted a nice centrist who'd win enough votes to become president, make some small token changes, but nothing revolutionary that would risk splitting the country. So we come to the 2020 election. The Democrats have a very diverse pool to choose from. What is the major reasonable debate? Do you really think Elizabeth Warren can defeat Donald Trump? We just won't win, or a young man in a homosexual relationship, or a Black woman. So they're going to compromise. They're going to create a cult of personality around Joe Biden that paints him as some type of benevolent uncle. He's always fought for equality, but can compromise and hold together the United States as it becomes more and more polarized. So I guess we can see from previous as it comes back and bites them. We don't believe that Joe Biden is Henry Clay. Clay is a symbol of a whole group of people, of a centrist wing in a political party. But to uphold law, because it's really embarrassing to get called dictator, because compromise sounds so nice, because you want to win the election, you'll go with a white male candidate, create a cult of personality around him, and ignore his past history with busing, putting people on buses. Look up what he did in the criminal justice reform sector, the war on drugs, Anita Hill, how he's admired for his ability to compromise with Republicans and make friends. This was another quote from an article that I found in Access. And across his decades in the Senate, Mr. Biden tended to find his way to the center of the fray: civil rights debates, judicial hearings, the crime bill, the Iraq war, priding himself on a reputation as the lawmaker most likely to befriend Ted Kennedy, and Strom Thurmond in the same lifetime. This was another article here too. Lock the SOBs up, Joe Biden in the era of mass incarceration. He now plays down his role overhauling crime laws with segregationist senators in the 80s and 90s. That portrayal today is at odds with his actions and rhetoric back then. In September 1994, as President Bill Clinton signed the new Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act in an elaborate choreographed ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House, Joseph R. Biden Jr. sat directly behind the president's lectern, flashing his trademark grin. For Mr. Clinton, the law was an immediate follow-through on his campaign promise to focus more federal attention on crime prevention. But for Mr. Biden, the moment was the culmination of his decades-long effort to more closely marry the Democratic Party and law enforcement, and to transform the country's criminal justice system in the process, and he had won. The truth is, Mr. Biden had boasted a year earlier in a speech on the Senate floor, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden. What we're becoming confused in as a movement is where we position ourselves regarding these external events. Last year, it was easy for everyone except for those that left. So I guess it wasn't so easy. The message was clear on this side of November 9, from 2016 to 2019, from the increase of knowledge, 2016 was the increase of knowledge, to the test. We're meant to see Donald Trump, see him for all that he is and all that he stands for. It's not one man, he's a symbol. The overthrow of the government began at 9/11. The Republicans begin to win in 2014. He's a symbol of something much bigger than himself. So for all those socially conservative people, they felt they were being pushed left. That was enough that was enough. We're in the left, but we're making some points in how we prophetically view Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Michael Moore, which certainly wasn't centrist. But now that we're on the other side over here of November 9, from the test to the increase of knowledge, Concord, many people are confused, and we can see why. It's not that they're doing bad things or they're bad people, but we're in a new testing time, a new dispensation, and as false liberalism has been addressed inside the movement, many people start to say, okay, that makes sense. We are centrist because of what Elder Tess said about false freedom. And I think we reviewed that a couple of weeks back. We want to challenge that understanding that we are not centrists. There are two misunderstandings in this movement. One is the idea that we are centrist, and that's a good thing, and that it is a good thing. We shouldn't be extreme. The second is the idea that we are centrist, and those supporting false freedom are saying they are the AOCs, and the Michael Moores, the protesters, the defenders of freedom. Neither misunderstanding is correct. Politically, externally, we should be seeing the correct arguments of the protesters. One of the key ideas behind the protests, one of the main things that they want, is to destroy this false cult of personality around these so-called good people revered by statues in the United States. We have not been controlled or guided by watching them. We have not learned from their protests. We were doing that, beginning that work a month before the death of George Floyd on April 18th in Portugal. This study would have come to the point that it is without them. So saying that we're learning from them, if I'm following that correctly, we have not been controlled or guided by watching them, the protests. We have not learned from their protests. We're not learning from what they're doing, because we were already talking about this in Portugal before this happened. Equality is a complex argument. It requires major restructuring in education, in healthcare, and in law enforcement, positions held to by Warren, by Sanders, by those considered extremists. Someone asked Biden if he would defund the police because does a local police force really need a tank? When asked if he would defund the police, he said absolutely not, because he's not an extremist. He's a centrist that can win the election. It's all part of dealing with the inequality and racism from the beginning of America. The message has guided us to see what is right and what is wrong. The news sources are important and helpful, but the lines themselves place us, and it's not as centrist. But who would be considered political extremists, even in liberal America, even in the Democrat Party? So we are not centrist. The lines, let's see, the news sources are important and helpful. The lines themselves place us not as centrist. The lines place us as those who are considered political extremists, even in liberal America, even in the Democrat Party, political extremists. So it wasn't the point in the studies to make an application of who will win the election. The movement does not know who will win the election. We haven't been prophetically shown that, but regardless of that, we have to know where we stand. Many people are asking questions about voting, and we're not saying whether or not people should vote, but one of the reasons people so desperately want to vote is because they feel hope in Biden, they should not feel. A Calhoun presidency would have been horrific, as would a Trump second term. But just like World War III, we should expect this crisis, the Sunday law issues, to be more subtle. We should have seen that develop when we said those horns aren't broken because America never stops pretending. We can see that in their history. The last dispensation in the latter reign and the testing issues associated with it, we had to see Trump externally, and then internally, FFA versus the midnight cry, talking about back here. The last dispensation in the latter reign and the testing issues associated with it, we had to see Trump. We were supposed to see Trump externally, and then we were to see FFA internally versus the midnight cry of radical equality. From 2019, Elder Tess and others felt no desire to read any more books about how bad Trump is, to share a multitude of articles about how bad he is, of the wickedness of the Republican Party. There has been no impulse to do that. You may have noticed that the media broadcast sharing less and less of him because we should already know it. It's not that we have changed or we shouldn't still follow what is occurring, but the test in this dispensation is more subtle. It's not the fight between good and evil that we simply saw in the last dispensation. It's the fight between evil and so-called compromised good. What we have in this dispensation is Biden. We'll just make it Republican and Democrat. What we're meant to see is Democrat compromise. Why did they compromise? The idea is if we don't compromise, we won't win over the people. And what's the internal of that? Because we have faced a shaking and rebellion in both dispensations. And the argument of the internal is the following. If we are these extremists, how will we ever win over Levites and Nethinims? How will we be successful as a movement? We have to compromise. Compromise on our vows, compromise on our reforms, which is all compromise on equality. That argument appears differently in different countries. In portions of Africa, it has presented itself in the following way. If we really believe in freedom, we will not force equality on the people. We will see cultural beauty in the dowry system. We will give freedom to practice equality to whatever extent and whatever way they choose. What's wrong with these ideas? You don't want to force equality on people. What's wrong with these ideas?
Freedom over equality.
I kind of missed part of that.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, when it says if we really, these are some of the arguments that are being presented, she says, in Africa, but the argument is, if we really believe in freedom, we won't force equality on people. So if we believe in freedom, yeah, I think that's what you said, freedom over equality. Is that what you said, Phil?
Yeah, which is really false freedom.
I was thinking also is you're not going to force equality. Well, if you don't force equality on somebody, what if that person is abusing their spouse? Just a broad look at it, you know, if you're not going to force equality on people, and of course you can't force anything on anybody, they have to choose. But if you don't have the radical address that it needs,
Yeah, exactly. They'll continue.
they just continue. Yeah. So you're still, so if you're choosing freedom over equality, then you're compromising and if I don't know if that's the right word, you're compromising and tolerating what the atrocities that are taking place against women and LGBT community. Because you don't want to force equality. So we see, and there's another part of the argument, we will go ahead.
Maybe it'll just go away.
Right, maybe it'll just go away, like slavery. Well, we proved that you can't clear the heart of your culture.
Yeah.
You can't clear the heart of your culture. So it's not gonna just go away. You're gonna choose one or the other. And one is gonna wind up on for eternity, and the other is gonna be eternal destruction. Because it's the end, like it was meant to be with slavery. It was the end. So we will see cultural beauty in the dowry system. We will give freedom to practice equality to whatever extent and whatever they choose. because God doesn't force and God doesn't kill. They're encouraged to go back and read the history of the Civil War. God took Abraham Lincoln by the throat and said, "You will abolish slavery." And he was willing to allow death in that process. He prolonged the war. That was the quote that kind of struck me, really, the comment she made that struck me about the Civil War. That, I mean, we knew it, but it was just the way, just reading it, that he prolonged it, and it was going to hurt a lot more people by reaching Abraham Lincoln to end slavery. God took Abraham Lincoln by the throat and said, "You will abolish slavery," and he was willing to allow death in that process. As they've made their argument for freedom, the idea is, how will you ever have success in South Sudan or in those many countries if you have a message against Lobola, which is, I think, the dowry system? So how are you going to reach people? Let's see, the idea is, how will you ever have success in South Sudan or many of those countries if you have a message against the Lobola, the dowry system? Teach equality, but don't practice it. You won't get the votes of the people. The movement doesn't have the right to remove teachers or leaders and attack on organization. Go back to Testimonies Volume 1 in the 350s, where when she's referring to a brother, and she names him who had pro-slavery sympathizers and came under church discipline. These arguments by people who claim to be for freedom, who claim to be holding up equality, are presenting to their people a compromised version. In that process, they are destroying them. And we watch the dead and the dying spiritually on every side. If people could see the carnage, they would not have any problem with those leaders being named. But we either don't believe the sin of the North, or we can't see it. In the Western world, compromise exhibits differently. I've thought about this a lot. We only see from our little small view here in our group. And this is a way to think of it. It is carnage, it is destruction that is happening, but think about, I think about about Elder Tess and how, with what she understands, and to see the movement as a whole. If people could see the carnage, they would not have any problem with those leaders being named. But we either don't believe the sin of the North, we either don't believe it, or we can't see it. And compromise looks different in the West. The problem in the history of Gethsemane here, 2016 to 2019, is that FFA has a feeling of what is right and wrong. And the message goes against what they feel is right or wrong. The same has occurred now. Many people have a feeling that there's nothing wrong with jewelry, with makeup, but those reformed vows infringe their freedom, This is something that the external world has known for years. In history, the Chinese used to bind their feet of their women. Mothers would do that to their daughters because it seemed to make them more desirable. In parts of Africa, they'll take a rusty knife and cut up a woman between her legs. It makes her more desirable. In South Korea, they cover themselves in toxic chemicals to bleach their skin because it makes them more desirable. In other parts of Africa, the women wear rings around their necks to make it appear longer, up to 25 pounds around their neck. Or they practice scarification. They create deep cuts across the body that scar it because it's considered desirable. And for 6,000 years, women have been taught that your value depends on how desirable you are. And this push for jewelry and everything associated with that kind of lifestyle, it's not that those women are somehow immoral and evil. It's that they're damaged by 6,000 years of sexism. And as a movement, we will not compromise and say that that is okay. Our position on jewelry does not make us centrists. The people that cannot see the inequality in those practices are suffering the same thing FFA did. It goes against their deep feeling about what is right or wrong. But we're not conservatives looking at a woman in a short skirt and judging her. We won't defend anyone thinking that way. What we see is the damage of sexism, and our position on the reform vows puts us on the extreme end of equality, not in the center. Mothers hold their daughter down while they perform genital mutilation because women struggle with equality. Women in the movement defend Lobola in their own slave trade because they fail to see the sin. It's been 6,000 years, but do we in this movement have the right to compromise what God is requiring us to learn through the message? Organization is a specifically severe test in this dispensation. For 30 years, there were women leaders in this movement. There was a female leader in Australia and in other parts of the world. For one of 31 years, they have had support from the leadership. 1 of 31 years. So is it any wonder now that people start to attack organization? Is it any wonder that US extremists, I don't know if that's right. Is there any wonder that extremists are wishing to uphold it strictly when you have a woman leader in North America, a woman leader in Oceania? It's as much a test here as it is there. No change was made to the organization of Oceania or Australia last year. There was only a verbal repetition of what had already been put in place, but it's not just on the continental level. We have a woman leader in South Sudan facing persecution and abuse. We have a woman leader in Argentina, a woman leader in the German world. Beneath them, we have female Bible workers through Africa now sitting on boards. The attacks occurring in this dispensation in Africa, in the West, in the name of absolute freedom, against the vows, against practiced organization and practiced equality, and nothing more than the internal application of the external compromise. It's false freedom versus the midnight cry. And we have the history of the Millerites to teach us that. So whoever wins, it does not change the course of the United States. If they were so supportive of Kamala Harris, why isn't she their presidential candidate? They balanced that presidential ticket just as the Whig Party did, just as the Republican Party did to win. We should go back and look at his record. We should see the inequality of today for what it is, the extent of it, and the historical causes of it to give legitimacy to so-called extremist positions like defund the police. If you want to vote, at least see that you would be voting for a compromised candidate. We weren't wishing to make application about who wins. What we need to see is why Ellen White's, maybe not her harshest words, but her most extensive condemnation is preserved for the North. If we can see the external danger and see the compromise, we'll understand the internal shaking. As much it is against what we might feel is the natural order of things, to bring those feelings in line with the midnight cry and not the other way around, to recognize organization and not just encourage, not just uplift, but respect the leadership of the women in charge. In reference to the local leaders, be they continental, be they on your boards, be they your Bible workers, because we've only begun this work and will only have its greatest success if we do it together. Tracing the history of Concord. This is the formalization. It is the agitation of the Sunday law and the entire world, for the entire world. It is not going to start here in a vacuum. It's going to build. So whatever issues God is forcing the world to look at in this history are issues that are about to test them, to save them, or to destroy them at the Sunday law. And when you think of that, what are we being forced to look at? What can you not escape?
What was the question?
Oh, let me back it up real quick. And from Tracing the History of Concord says, whatever issues God is forcing the world to look at in this history are the issues that are about to test them, to save them or to destroy them at the Sunday law. So what are the issues in the dispensation we're now in, because this was before 2021, what are the issues that the world is being forced to see?
The abuse,
Try that again.
Gender equality,
gender equality,
oppression of one,
Yeah.
abortion.
And we can trace the history back and show by the Democrats not taking the hard enough stand and compromising, it allows your enemy to come in and swamp over you. Swamp's not the right word, but I think you know what I mean. Swallow you. So what are they swallowing up the Democrats on? In sexism and equality. Equality is the issue. Equality is the test. And by not being strong enough on equality, it's given an edge to the enemy. It's interesting that she makes that comment about, I don't think I changed, I hope that's the right slide. She makes that comment about Abraham Lincoln, that God had his hand on the throat of Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so whoever wins, it does not change the course of the United States. If they were so supportive of Kamala Harris, why isn't she then their presidential candidate? They've balanced that presidential ticket just as the Whig Party did, just as the Republican Party did to win people. We should go back and look at his record. And I think we did this one. Somehow I wound up backing up somewhere. Okay. So delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 hotly debated the issue of slavery. George Mason of Virginia argued eloquently against slavery, warning his fellow delegates. So this is George Mason of Virginia arguing against slavery. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. Southern delegates, on the other hand, argued strenuously that the new government should not be allowed to interfere with the institution of slavery. Delegate John Rutledge of South Carolina, for example, told delegates that religion and humanity have nothing to do with the questions of whether the Constitution should protect slavery. It was simply a question of property rights. Not about slavery being right or wrong, it's about property rights. In other words, you own a person, is that correct? Is that what it does? As I understand that correctly?
That's how I see it. I read it.
The Constitution that the delegates proposed included several provisions that explicitly recognized and protected slavery. I know Phil's trying to talk. Wish I could hear him. Yeah, I didn't hear you, Phil. Wasn't able to hear it. Okay, so the Constitution that the delegates proposed included several provisions that explicitly recognized and protected slavery. Without these provisions, Southern delegates would not support the new Constitution, and without the Southern states on board, the Constitution had no chance of being ratified. Provisions allowed Southern states to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportionment in Congress, even though the slaves could not, of course, vote. They expressly denied the Congress the power to prohibit importation of new slaves until 1808 and prevented free states from enacting laws protecting fugitive slaves. Slavery, as all students of history know, continued to be a divisive issue up through the Civil War. Southern states worried that the balance in Congress might tip against slavery. Southern states worried that the balance in Congress might tip against slavery, and so were anxious to extend slavery to new territories and states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, enacted at a time when slave states and non-slave states had equal representation in the Senate, permitted slavery in Missouri, but prohibited slavery in portions of the Louisiana Purchase north of 3630. The Supreme Court, in its infamous decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857, ruled that Congress lacked the power to prohibit slavery in its territories. In so doing, Scott versus Sanford invited slave owners to pour into the territories and pass pro-slavery constitutions. The decision made the Civil War inevitable. Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority in Scott, also concluded that people of African ancestry, whether free or slave, including Scott, could never become citizens within the meaning of the Constitution and hence lacked the ability to bring suit in federal court. Before the Civil War ended, Congress passed and sent to the states for ratification the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, and authorized Congress to enact appropriate legislation implementing the abolition. The amendment was understood to also make Black citizens of the United States, overruling Dred Scott on that point. The House votes to propose the 13th Amendment following the Senate vote and barely made the 2/3 majority requirement. When the vote was announced, the galleries cheered. Congressmen embraced and wept, and Capitol cannons boomed a 100-gun salute. Congressman George Julian of Indiana wrote in his diary, "I have felt ever since the vote as if I were in a new country." Ratification by the states quickly followed, and Secretary of State Seward proclaimed the amendment adopted December 18th, 1865. So Secretary of State Seward, is that got to be the same guy? Proclaimed the amendment adopted December 18, 1865. Less than a year after ratification of the 13th Amendment, Congress used its newly conferred power to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, giving Black citizens the same right in every state to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, to inherit, purchase, sell, and convey real and personal property, and to the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, as is enjoined by white citizens. Supporters of the 1866 law argued that its guarantees constituted appropriate means of enforcing the right of Blacks not to be held in bondage. The 13th Amendment, unlike most provisions in the Constitution, is self-executing in that it directly reaches, even without action by Congress, conduct by private individuals, slaveholders. Because of this fact, Congress's power under the 13th Amendment allows it to punish forms of private conduct when it might not be able to do so under an amendment such as the 14th, which restricts the conduct of states, prohibiting states from denying equal protection of the laws or due process. First wave feminism, 1848 to 1920. People have been suggesting things along the line of, are women maybe human beings? for all of history, so first wave feminism doesn't refer to the first feminist thinkers in history. It refers to the West's first sustained political movement dedicated to achieving political equality for women, the suffragettes of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. For 70 years, the first wavers would march, lecture, and protest and face arrest, ridicule, and violence as they fought tooth and nail for the right to vote. As Susan B. Anthony's biographer, Ida Husted Harper would put it, suffrage was the right that once a woman had won it, would secure to her all others. The first wave basically begins at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. There, almost 200 women met in a church in upstate New York to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. Attendees discussed their grievances and passed a list of 12 resolutions calling for specific equal rights, including, after much debate, the right to vote. Second wave feminism from 1963 to the 1980s. The second wave of feminism begins with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which came out in 1963. There were prominent feminist thinkers before Friedan who would come to be associated with the second wave. Most importantly, Simone de Beauvoir, whose Second Sex came out in France in 1949 and in the US in 1953. But the feminine mystique was a phenomenon. It sold 3 million copies in 3 years. The feminine mystique rails against the problem that has no name, the systemic sexism that taught women that their place was in the home and that if they were unhappy as housewives, it was only because they were broken and perverse. I thought there was something wrong with me because I didn't have an orgasm waxing the kitchen floor, Friedan later quipped. But she argued the fault didn't truly lie with women, but rather with the world that refused to allow them to exercise their creative and intellectual faculties. Women were right to be unhappy. They were being ripped off. The second wave worked on getting women the right to hold credit cards under their own names and to apply for mortgages. It worked to outlaw marital rape, to raise awareness about domestic violence and build shelters for women fleeing rape and domestic violence. It worked to name and legislate against sexual harassment in the workplace. But perhaps just as central was the second wave's focus on changing the way society thought about women. The second wave cared deeply about the casual systemic sexism ingrained into society. The belief that women's highest purposes were domestic and decorative, and the social standards that reinforced that belief, and in naming that sexism and ripping it apart. It's kind of interesting when you think about the progress of it. We've got the first wave, takes them 70 years before they get the right to vote. It's almost like when you pull back and look at it, they give little tokens, but don't want to go any further. And then they give a few more tokens as long as the women don't push for any further. But as the women continue to push, and you've got that misogynistic power behind the scenes all the time. And when you push too hard, they fight back. Is there a doctor in the White House? Not if you need an MD. Joe Biden should think about dropping the honorific, which feels fraudulent, even comic. Madam First Lady, Mrs. Biden, Jill Kiddo, a bit of advice on what may seem like a small, but I think is not an important matter. Any chance you might drop the doctor before your name? Dr. Joe Biden sounds and feels fraudulent, not to say a touch comic. Your degree is, I believe, an EDD, a Doctor of Education, earned at the University of Delaware through a dissertation with the promising title, Student Retention at the community college level, meeting students' needs. A wise man once said that no one should call himself doctor unless he has delivered a child. Think about it, Dr. Jill, and forthwith drop the doc. So that was an article that was a Vox article talking about her. Violence against LGBT people. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people sometimes experience violence directed toward their sexuality or gender identity. This violence may be enacted by the state, as in laws prescribing punishment for homosexual acts, or by individuals. It may be psychological or physical and motivated by homophobia, lesbophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. Influencing factors may be cultural, religious, or political mores and biases. Currently, homosexual acts are legal in almost all Western countries, and in many of these countries, violence against LGBT people is classified as a hate crime. Outside the West, many countries are deemed potentially dangerous to their LGBT population due to both discriminatory legislation and threats of violence. These include countries where the dominant religion is Islam, most African countries except South Africa, most Asian countries other than Israel, Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, and the Philippines, and some former communist countries such as Russia, Poland, LGBT-free zone, Serbia, Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Bosnia, and I don't know if I can get this one, Herzegovina. Such violence is often associated with religious condemnation of homosexuality or conservative social attitudes that portray homosexuality as an illness or a character flaw. In Europe, the European Employment Equality Framework Directive and Charter of Fundamental Rights offer some protection against sexuality-based discrimination. Historically, state-sanctioned persecution of homosexuals was mostly limited to male homosexuality, termed sodomy. During the medieval and early modern period, the penalty for sodomy was usually death. During the modern period, from the 19th century to mid-20th century in the Western world, the penalty was usually a fine or imprisonment. There was a drop in locations where homosexual acts remained illegal from 2009, when there were 80 countries worldwide, notably throughout the Middle East, Central Asia, and most of Africa, but also in some of the Caribbean and Oceania, with 5 carrying the death penalty, to 2016, when 17 countries criminalized consensual sexual acts between adults of the same sex. Brazil, a country with LGBT rights protections and legal same-sex marriage, is reported to have the world's highest LGBT murder rate, with more than 380 murders in 2017 alone, an increase of 30% compared to 2016. This is usually not considered a hate crime in Brazil, but a misrepresentation of skewed data resulting from relatively higher crime rates in the country in general when compared to world averages, rather than the LGBT population being specific target. In some countries, 85% of LGBT students experience homophobic and transphobic violence in school, and 45% of transgender students drop out of school. I think that's the end. Yeah, I didn't mean to go here. Hang on one second. So, yeah, that was the end. That's what I thought. So what have we learned today, or refreshed our memories of today? Anybody?
Oh, I was going to make a comment regarding what I heard Elder Tess the other day saying how she, how they had disciplined one of the brethren. She didn't say where he was from, but he was like abusing the younger females. And he's the guy that actually asked her about like one of those ideology ideas that he still has with him. So I think that steps are taken for those people that are still holding on to well, I'm saying to the obvious ones, right? To the obvious ones that are still holding on to that misogyny. I don't know how to say that word, misogyny. Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else? Phil put in the chat, can't compromise. So you have in the movement, the ones that are compromising or the ones that still don't get it? What is it? You know, because I look at myself and I know I'm slow to understand things. And I'm always worried of my lack of understanding or slow to get something puts me in the wrong light. I know that, and I said this earlier about looking at men who have even been born into this misogynistic mess of a world, but they still have a choice to, I don't know, when you go back to Portugal, and Elder Parmenter studies on the 6 commandments, the test of loving humanity. If you still want to call loving humanity if you still want to call this patriarchal structure that oppresses women, and that's loving humanity, we've had our opportunity to see it's wrong. And so many other things. We've had our opportunity to see it's wrong. And the world is having their opportunity to see it's wrong. The people with the history we were just reading, they had their opportunity to see that slavery was wrong, even though they justify it because in the Constitution, the word slavery isn't there,